Okay, hello. This is the third lecture in a series on exchange theory, and this is the second time I'm doing it today because for some reason the audio didn't record. That's all right. I'll do it again. And so yeah, we're talking about Peter Blau's exchange theory, and we focus on one aspect, which is how do you get power in exchange, right? And I gave you a couple examples of some notorious exchanges going on. I mean, things like this happen. That's the way this world is. I know people want to deny it and believe that it's all good and nothing bad happens. But here's Aegis Corporation, a British private military security corporation, overthrowing the Zimbabwe government in exchange for oil concessions. And then they did the same thing, overthrowing the Sierra Leone government in exchange for mining concessions, and they have diamond mines over there. Um, so we talked about having power in exchange or lacking power in exchange, right? If you need a commodity that you don't possess, and someone else has that commodity, but doesn't need anything from you, then you lack power in exchange, all right? And I gave 5 examples of how you can turn the tables, all right? We focused on this fifth one, which is create demand in the other person for a commodity that you possess. And I gave a number of examples of drugs, how drugs are used that way, getting kids hooked on crack or whatever to create demand for their product. You know, I gave you example of pimps and prostitutes, how they get them addicted to drugs. Gave the example of British opium trade, a classic triangle trade done for many years, centuries this was done. And example is CIA heroin operations in the Golden Triangle. All right, talked about that and how this was a triangle trade also. And that leads us to a discussion of the oil industry, right? And when I go through my history of U.S. actions in the Middle East, I'll show how basically exchange theory is used to gain power in exchange, right? I gave you a brief history of the problem that we faced, reaching peak oil in 1970, and it was all downhill from there as far as U.S. oil production until fracking kicked in fairly recently, right? And even though our oil production was falling, demand kept increasing, consumption kept increasing, and how did we deal with this problem? What problem did that cause? Right. Um, all right, and then I gave you a brief introduction to uh, a statement by the director of the CIA, James Woolsey, who said that uh, uh, the first priority of governments, right, should be destroying oil's monopoly on transportation and OPEC's cartel. How do you destroy them? Right? He said you have to destroy them. That should be the first priority of government for the economic viability of our country, our national security, and the stability of many other nations in the world as well. Right? And who is James Woolsey? Well, he's a member of the board of Genie Energy, interested in getting Golden Heights oil. There's a big effort to get that, and it kind of fizzled. But Dick Cheney's on it with him. There's Woolsey, Rothschild, Rupert Murdoch of Fox News, Bill Richardson of Clinton administration, Larry Summers. I think it was Clinton administration too. All right, and then I taught you briefly, if you recall, why oil is so important. It industrial economies are based upon commerce, and commerce is based upon transportation. You have to transport goods from to get them to market. It's just the way it is, and transportation is based on oil, right? And then I said not just for transportation, but for producing material. The vast majority of things made today are not made of natural materials like wood or plants or animals, or you know, basic things like metals, right? It's made from products made from oil, right? And yeah, so let's see here. So I showed you why oil is important, right? It's because it's a quick, cheap source of basic hydrocarbon molecules that are easy to separate through fractional distillation, right? And then how carbon is the most versatile element, right? Because you can make many types of bonds, double, single, triple bonds, but more so because its electronegativity is 2.5, right in the middle of the range, which means that virtually everything carbon bonds with is going to form a covalent bond, which means it's going to form a molecule instead of a crystal lattice structure of a simple mineral salt crystal, right? Which you can't do anything with. You can't do much with, right? Compared to the vast possibilities of making all these complex molecules. For example, all the complex molecules that are the basis of life. Here's just a couple examples. Here is a very complex protein. That's a molecule, uh, which is a cell signaling molecule. Here's an enzyme, super complex. Without this, without its exact shape and function, you cannot live without these, right? So carbon is super versatile. You can make virtually any molecule you want, all right, with any function. Okay, and then we said that oil, you find oil in everything, in so many ways, which you don't even realize. Here's a example of ground beef, right? When you go buy some ground beef at the grocery store, well, oil went into the styrofoam container, the plastic wrap, the absorbent liner, the ink on the label, fuel for transportation, fuel for refrigeration, every vaccination, uh, every antibiotic, uh, medicine, steroid given to the cattle, fertilizer to grow the feed or fodder, right, or hay, whatever they're eating, fuel for farming and transportation, right, on and on. And um, we looked at the overall effect of oil on our economy, how it was a major inflationary factor, and how that killed our economy. I showed you this correlation. It's like almost near perfect correlation between oil price, inflation, and how our economy tanks during times of high inflation. Uh, High inflation causing uh, increasing prices, difficulty in purchasing goods, uh, high interest rates, right? So then the next thing I showed you I taught you about is uh, factors that affect oil price. This is something that I threw up in about an hour, maybe a little bit less than an hour, although I tweaked it since then, just here and there. But the basic thing I got down in about an hour, which means I have a holistic, integrated understanding of the, 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 the factors that cause oil price. All right, so let's get to today's lecture. Um, it deals with the history of oil industry, how it developed, right? And we're going to go through how the U.S. got an interest in Middle East oil for a time until the fears were subsided. And then after World War II, we regained interest in Middle East oil. And some of the things we did, like we overthrew the Iranian government for oil, all right? So overthrowing the government, I mean, many people may think, oh, that's okay, that's good, overthrow a government, get what we want. And then let's see here how we reached peak oil, and then our consumption exceeded production, how we lost control of price, right? And then a key thing we're going to talk about today is the Iran-Iraq War, right? And that'll be a main focus. And I'll finish up with a discussion of uh, U.S. support for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, and how that led to attack upon one of our ships, the USS Stark, right? Also, another ship of ours, the Roberts, was hit by a mine. So we'll talk about that today. All right, so let's get right to it then. All right. So in 1973 and 1979, there were oil shocks that whacked our economy. All right. How do we cope? How do we turn the tables back then? Right? Remember, I said there's 5 ways you could do to turn the tables and get power in exchange. One is you find an alternative source of supply, and that was done in a sense. Um, to a certain degree, there were new oil sources found. For example, Alaskan oil and North Sea oil both kind of came online and became predominant in the late 70s. All right. Today, the big thing is fracking. That's had a major impact. It's a large source of oil, and we'll take a look at that real quick. So this shows the history of U.S. oil production, right? Barrels per day. Remember, I told you that we reached peak oil in 1970, right? From there on, it dropped. It was falling off, but this is the addition of Alaskan oil. It helped buffer the fall, but it's still falling, right? Alaskan oil itself was falling. The rest of oil production is falling until about 2010, when fracking became big, and it started going up. Its highest point is up to here. I believe we're over 12 million barrels per day now. We're up here somewhere. The U.S. is the largest producer of oil in the world today. Right? You may think Saudi Arabia or Russia or something like that. No, it's the U.S. Right, and it's due to fracking. And what fracking is, just to show you real quick, is its ability to capture oil that was inaccessible before. It's called tight oil or shale oil. It's oil that's trapped in layers of shale rock, which is a form of sedimentary rock, right? Formed the layers laid down and pressed hard under pressure and heat, right? And to get this oil, what they do is they do something called slant drilling, where you can drill straight down, but then you can go at an angle, right? In these horizontal tracks through the rock, and then you pump high pressure water, super high pressure water. That hydraulic pressure smashes up the rock and releases the oil, and then so you get oil coming out here. All right. And here's production in the U.S. Just the last few years, it's been going up steady, and it's due to the fracking that's coming online here. These are different fracking fields. All right, main ones, Bacon, that's up in North Dakota, Montana, and then this Niobrara is Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado. A little bit into Kansas. This Anadarko is mostly Oklahoma, then Permian in Texas and New Mexico. Well, you see these, right? All right, so this is where the fracking's at. I'm not going to go into any more detail there. All right, so now let's talk about the history of the oil industry, right? So oil, and the tars have been known for many, many centuries, going way back, right? But as far as use of it, a key step in the use of crude oil, petroleum, was in 1855, the first fractional distillation of petroleum, right? So what fractional distillation is you boil that petroleum, right, basically, and petroleum is a mixture of all sorts of different hydrocarbons. Some of them are short chain that have weak attraction, and they boil off at lower temperatures. The longer chain molecules boil off at higher temperatures. So the first things that boil off are the short chain hydrocarbons, and you can use those for fuel like gasoline or diesel and so forth. All right, uh, and then you boil off the longer chain later on. Now, after diesel, a little higher up, you have kerosene, and that was really the first main use of oil. Right, it was used for lighting, and prior to using kerosene, they would use whale oil. Right, and this gets kind of expensive. You have to go out and go hunt the whales, and the whale populations are being depleted. So it helped to use uh, oil from the ground instead of whale oil. All right. Uh, 1859 was the discovery of the first significant well in the United States, in the world, really, right? And that was at the Drake well at Titusville, Pennsylvania. All right. Then in 1860, you had the first effective internal combustion engine to use the products of oil, which is the gasoline and diesel, right? And here it is, a very simple rudimentary machine, a single cylinder, right? Potential demand for oil. I say potential because it's basically nothing at this point, right? And then in 1886, Carl Benz designed the first automobile. There it is, another rudimentary machine, and potential demand for oil, right? A lot, a lot of this demand did not increase until the 20th century, and even after World War One. For example, right about the time of the end of World War One, about 8% of the population had a car, owned a car, right? But within 10 years after World War One, gasoline consumption went up 10 times, right? So it started taking off. Even then, it was still slow. Even at World War Two, not too many people had cars. Maybe about a third of the people. It wasn't until the 1950s when cars became more popularly owned, right? All right. Now, this is kind of important because oil used for lighting was starting to be replaced by electricity. And again, this is early in slow start, and electricity didn't really become dominant until the 20th century. All right, but Edison invented the first 1500-hour light bulb in 1880. Right, and then in 1900 to 1904, you have oil being used in other vehicles. First one was a submarine. The USS Holland had a gasoline engine built in 1900. And then the Wright brothers developed the airplanes. That was 1903 at Kitty Hawk. And then the first British ship to be powered by oil was HMS Spiteful destroyer, right? British kind of led the way in converting over from coal to oil. Uh, and then in 1907, the first synthetic use for oil was found by this guy, Bakelin, who invented a product called Bakelite, was the first commercially successful plastic from oil, right? And, today, like I said, what isn't made from oil? The question is not what is made from oil, it's what isn't. If it's not metal, glass, ceramic, wood, you know, some cotton thing, like cotton fiber, like or some animal like leather, right? It's made from oil, right? Every pharmaceutical, you know, just go in your medicine cabinet. Anything in your medicine cabinet is made from oil. Uh, any soap, you know. Okay, any plastic. All right, so in 1911, there was, at least by then, a realization of the strategic value of oil, right? Uh, uh, the wealth and power of nation was based in commerce and mercantilism, right? And this is going to be based in oil because the future of commercial and military ships will be fuel oil burners driving steam turbines, all right? Coal-fired boilers pushing these reciprocating piston steam engines are going to be antiquated, right? And the Great Britain, the Royal Navy conversion from coal to oil began under Admiral John Fisher, who during this time, 1904, 1910, was the First Lord of the Admiralty, kind of like the United States Navy's Secretary of State. And so he oversaw the conversion of the Spiteful here, 1904. And this continued under Churchill, Winston Churchill, 1911, 1915. And he pushed for 5 British battleships to be oil powered, right? They were launched at the beginning of 1914. The U.S. also at this time was pushing for a conversion to fuel oil. USS Nevada, 1916, and her sister ship, the Oklahoma, were both fuel oil burners. Now, here are some advantages of fuel oil, right? For one, you can have a closed boiler, and that allows you to have forced draft blowers, which are just like a supercharger or a turbocharger, blowing in extra air to get extra oxygen to burn cleaner and hotter, right? Getting more power out of that oil. Uh, and then that allowed for use of higher steam pressures and temperatures, faster ships. You get a maneuvering advantage, which was important back in the day when you didn't have, aircraft carriers to do combat with ships. You had to get within gun range. You had to go toe to toe close, and in such a situation, speed and maneuverability was of an essence, right? To gain an advantage. Right? Oil has twice the thermal content per volume than coal, which means you get longer range. You're less dependent upon having to pull into overseas coaling stations to refuel, right? These coaling stations can be vulnerable to attack and seizure by your enemy, and then you're screwed. You can't operate in an area unless you have fuel to keep your ships running. Underway refueling at sea, so that also extends range, right? And then you don't have to pull into a port, divert from your route. You can just refuel at sea with oil. Can't do that with coal. Need for less manpower. You don't need to have all these men hauling bags of coal to get it to the boiler. You just have a pump, and it does it for you. It's easy. It's quick. Less manpower. Then you have more space for munitions and supplies. Longer operation. Um, Okay, and then there's advantages of damage control law, which I'll explain in a second. But let's take a look at the review of mercantilism. All right, we talked about the mercantilist program. It's very involved and complex. I'm not going to get into all the details again, but just show you real quickly the basic idea that the wealth and power of nations is based upon trade, arbitrage, commerce. Right. This is how you get your wealth. And I remember I told you about arbitrage, which is purchasing commodities in a market where there's a low price, shipping it to markets where they're high price, and you make a profit, right? And this is the source of wealth of nations, which is the basis of national power. And with this, you build your military power with that wealth, uh, both naval and ground forces. And then you use that to control markets. You use that to control overseas territory. You use that to control shipping lanes, the trade routes, without which you can't access this wealth, right? And then we said with the Industrial Revolution, military industry itself became a source of wealth through a Keynesian demand side stimulus sort of way. All right, so oil-powered naval ships and merchant ships will be the way of the future, and it's because there's key advantages, right? So we said here as far as as far as mercantilism, why was Great Britain, the tiny little country with no resources, all right? Why were they the dominant world power for many centuries, right? So the answer is they had a dominant navy, and they controlled the trade routes. They controlled commerce. They monopolized wealth generation. And then, in addition to that, later this is really secondary, but they became the first nation to industrialize, right? Which added into this means of wealth generation. All right. Okay, so now here's the advantages of oil over coal. There's coal, very clumsy to use, right? Oil is a liquid. You can just pump this with a pump. Uh, per volume, right? Oil has twice the energy content of coal, right? That means longer range, right? That means less reliance upon overseas bases. That means you can operate longer at sea, right? Cover more distance. Another is coal. You have to keep shoveling in that coal. So you have the open furnace, right? Now with an open furnace, that means you cannot blow in extra air to get more oxygen, for it to burn better and hotter, all right? Because that air is going to just blow out and fry this guy. It's going to cook him, all right? The only way to get air is to create convection currents with a chimney, with a stack, right? The stack is going to contain the hotter, less dense air, which is going to rise, and that rising air is going to create a current that's going to pull air in through here, go up the stack, right? You can't blow extra air in, otherwise it's going to blow out this way. And that's not true with a fuel oil. With fuel oil, you don't have to have a guy with the door open showing it. You can have a totally closed container and spray in the oil, do the burners. The burners are down here, actually. Create the flame, and then you can add more oxygen by blowing in extra air. It's going to burn hotter, burn cleaner, get higher temperatures, and then with higher temperatures, you're going to get higher pressures. All right? With higher pressure steam, you don't have to just push these primitive, inefficient, reciprocating steam piston engines, right? You can push these far more sophisticated steam turbines, and this is one steam turbine. Looks like there's two, but there's really just two sections. You have a high pressure section here. You blow in your high pressure steam. At each blade is a stage that extracts energy. So with these simple piston things, the most advanced piston engines had 3 or 4 stages. So you blow steam into one piston, right? Exhaust to another piston that powers the other piston, then exhaust and that powers another piston. That's it. You got 3 stages. You're extracting energy at 3 levels. It's very inefficient. You're wasting a lot of energy. Here, with these steam turbines, you got 2 of these, high pressure, low pressure, and look at all the different turbine blades. That's a stage where you extract a fraction of energy out of that steam, right? At each of these, and it's highly efficient at extracting energy. So high pressure here, as you go along each stage, pressure drops, right? Because energy is being taken out, and then it's pumped. It's sent into the low pressure. From here, it's sent into the low pressure turbine, right? By the time you get to the end stages over here, pressure's at a vacuum, and it's still extracting energy at a vacuum because the condenser, where the steam is blown into and turned back to water, that's operating at near perfect vacuum. So it's sucking that steam through, right? Which is turning the blades, which is extracting energy. So it's highly efficient, right? Which means all of this means higher steam pressures, more efficient energy extraction. You're going faster, right? And that's important back in the day, right? Before aircraft carriers, before long-range missiles, to do combat at sea, whether it's sailing vessels, or powered vessels, before aircraft, you had to come within gun range, right? You got to come close, and that means if you had a speed advantage, you had advantage in maneuver. And here's a simple maneuver. Here's 2 enemy fleets, one enemy fleet, another enemy fleet. They're approaching each other. This one here crosses the T. If you can outmaneuver your enemy, for example, the classic goal was to cross the T, you get a full broadside, all your guns lined up facing this ship. They can have only the front guns aiming at you, right? And you can just whack them. The last crossing of the T occurred at the Battle of Surigel Straits during the Battle of Lady Gulf, one of the 4 battles at Lady Gulf, right? And a lot of those ships were resurrected ships from Pearl Harbor, some of the battleships. Anyways, all right. Here's underway replenishment. Here's a big oil tanker. Here's a warship. Right. You can't do this with coal. With oil, you just send the hose over there, and then you just pump oil, refuel them. And here's the damage control situation. This is a ship that we're going to talk about today called the USS Stark. It was hit by two Iraqi Exocet missiles, French-made missiles, and it's listing heavily to port. Right, got hit from the port side. It's flooded there. A lot of fire water, fire hose water, probably flooded it too. Now, to help right the ship, to correct the list, you can take fuel, oil, and tanks on the port side, pump it to the starboard side. Real simple. All right. All right. So the future of world power is going to be in oil, not coal. That makes it important to get access to oil, and the British were lucky. In 1908, they discovered oil in Iran, called Persia back then. Right, that was one of the first, the first big uh, oil well produced in Iran, 1908. And by 1914, the British government agreed with Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at that time, that the government should acquire a controlling interest in a reliable source of oil. So they purchased a 51% shareholder of Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which today is BP, British Petroleum. And they obtained a 20-year contract for fuel oil, make sure they got oil for their Navy. Right? And the same year, Standard Oil invented cracking. Right? What cracking is, remember I told you how fractional distillation, you separate out the different sizes of molecules of hydrocarbons, small ones with low melting point from larger and larger and larger ones, right? Right? Now, only the small ones, which are lighter, lower multi point, uh, more fluid, less viscous, right? They're used for fuel oils like gasoline. It's almost like water, diesel, right? And there's smaller, shorter chain hydrocarbon molecules, right? Now, most oil is not that, right? But you can make more of the shorter chain fuel uh, by cracking, which is breaking up the larger molecules. And Standard Oil discovered how to do that, how to take the long chain hydrocarbons, break them up into smaller ones, which are the size suitable for fuels. Uh, all right, so that increased the amount of oil fuels you get from oil. Then, with World War One, you had a big increase in oil consumption. More important than that is the first realization of the strategic value of oil fully realized, especially in logistics. Right, the versatility and flexibility of trucks over trains. Trains, of course, you're dependent upon where you lay the tracks. That may not be where your lines are. I mean, World War One was not a big maneuver warfare war, right? But still, you had to have your lines close to your tracks, right, to get to supply your forces. Uh, with trucks, well, you can bridge the gap by using trucks to transport things to the front lines, right? Well, what this opened up was the flexible supply lines, which made possible maneuver warfare, which really didn't wasn't manifest to World War II. Uh, Germans showed the way initially, but in any event, World War One showed an increased demand for oil, and use in tanks, use in aircraft, use in trucks. All right. Um, first start of the big use of oil. Couple of battles here over oil. Germany is resource poor. They basically don't have much. They got some coal. They got agriculture. Right. No oil. So they made a play to get Ploesti oil in Romania, and they tried to get Baku oil. Let me try to pull them up, show you where they're at. on. There you go. All right. Ploesti oil is in Romania, kind of south central Romania, right below that mountain range there, somewhere around there. That's Ploesti. That oil was developed by Standard Oil overseas. It was all these Western countries were developing foreign oil because they had the technology and know-how, right? Then Azerbaijan, Baku oil is right here. Let me go closer. See that little tip there? That's Baku, right? This is Russian oil, later Soviet oil, developed by first the Nobel family. What did the Nobles invent? Like dynamite, TNT, or something? I don't know. Explosives. All right. Uh, 1919 to the 1920s. Uh, at the end of World War One, U.S. leaders feared that U.S. oil reserves would be depleted. So where was U.S. oil prior to the 20s? It was in Pennsylvania. That's where oil was discovered. So the start of the oil industry was in the United States, not the Middle East, as you might think. USA was the start of the oil industry, and it was in Pennsylvania. That's where J.D. Rockefeller got his wealth from, got his start. Um Wilson demands a share of Iraq oil at the Paris Peace Conference. Right? He knows they fear we're going to run out of oil. Right? We better get a stake in Middle East oil, Iraq oil. And Secretary of State Lansing pushed hard to get a stake in Middle East oil too. Right? And in 1920, oh, by the way, uh, whenever you see in red nationalized, that means um, uh, foreign oil, which was developed by a Western oil company, was nationalized by the local nation. They took control of their own oil. So the West lost control over that oil, right? What I say about here, if you don't believe any of this, look it up. If you don't look it up, then just shut up, right? I know people are gonna want to attack and say, "Oh, bullshit, bullshit, bullshit." You know, look it up or shut up. People don't look up Jack. I know that's what's going to happen. All right, so the first nationalization of oil was the Baku oil. Remember, I showed you that little point coming off into the Caspian Sea. So they nationalized the oil after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. By 1920, they took control. The Bolsheviks, right? Then in the 20s, up to 1940s, I guess, fears of U.S. oil being depleted were eased by big discoveries in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. There's Texas, Oklahoma, California, all right? And the U.S. became the big supplier of oil in the world. About 70% of world production was provided by the United States during this time, right? Then in 38, the second country to nationalize was Mexico. They nationalized their foreign oil, developed by Western companies. I'm not sure which. Probably one of the American companies, Standard or Chevron or something. I don't know. And then also in 1938, Standard Oil of Southern California discovers Saudi oil. So they know there's oil out there in Saudi Arabia. Oil already is known in Iran and in Iraq. Let me show you a map then real quick. So here is Iran, 1908. This is the first Middle East oil. Then Iraq oil was discovered, right? Now by 38, Saudi Arabian oil is known. Okay, which is the largest oil reserves out there in the Middle East. Okay, so fears of loss of oil, it subsides there, right? We got plenty of oil, and okay. Oh, and then in 1935, nylon is invented, first synthetic fiber made from oil, right? So you're starting to use oil for a few things here. Not many. Bakelite, nylon now, nylon stockings, nylon for parachutes instead of silk. Okay. All right. 1943. So 1943, the U.S. makes a deal, a 50-50 deal with Venezuela. So what happened was FDR wanted to avert another revolution and nationalizing of oil by making a 50-50 deal with Venezuela to avoid another Mexico, right? And so he pushed to have this 50-50 deal to avert revolutionary movements and their nationalization of oil, like Mexico did, right? So they proposed a 50-50 split of profits between the oil company, the U.S. oil company that developed the oil, and the host nation where the oil is. So they get you know, it was seen that 50-50 was a good even number, seen as fair, split right down the middle, right? This would later come back to bite them in the butt in Iran here. I'll explain that. Um, okay, where are we at here? All right, so 1939 to 1945, World War II is being fought. And of course, during this time, it's a time of very high consumption of oil. And it brings renewed fears that U.S. oil reserves will be depleted. And in February of 1945, FDR makes a deal with the Saudi royal family saying, hey, we'll keep you in power if you ensure you provide us a reliable source of oil. This marks the start of a big U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Now we're going to need the Middle East oil. Um, and yeah, so we know we're going to need Middle East oil. It's going to become more and more critical. Our oil reserves are not unlimited. And in 1951, we established the United States military training mission in Saudi Arabia. This is a U.S. training support mission, but really, they were in full command of the Saudi army, right? So a foreign nation, the United States, was commanding the Saudi army, the Saudi Internal Security Force. Um, I also want to mention how oil was important in manufacturing U.S. involvement in World War II. I taught you this. I hope you remember how this happened, right? That this was something that was done, how the FDR administration basically maneuvered Japan into attacking by cutting off oil. And it wasn't just the U.S., they got Britain, Dutch, and U.S. all to cut off oil on the same day, July 25th of 1941. And that set in motion the Pearl Harbor attack, right? Pearl Harbor wasn't even the focus. The focus was Dutch East Indies oils. That's what Japan had to get, right? All right, then 1941 in October. This is the statement by Ickes, right? This is after Germany had already invaded Russia, and they're going for that Baku oil, and they're going for all the Russian resources, right? Remember, we said Germany was resource poor. They didn't have iron ore, aluminum ore. They didn't have oil, you know. Uh, they didn't even have enough food for the people. So they're going, for this to capture the Russian stuff, right? And Russian oil was in Baku. So let's take a look at the map again. So here's Baku right there. This is Russian oil. Today it's in Azerbaijan, an independent country. But yeah, and this is what Icky said. He said, you know, they're invading. Germany's invading Russia. They're coming down here, right, through the Caucasus. They're trying to get Azerbaijan, Baku oil, right? And then he said, well, what's right below Azerbaijan, right? Baku, Iran, all the Iranian oil. Well, what's right next to Iran? Iraq, all the Iraqi oil. He said they're going to have the lion's share of the world's oil, and that's going to make them the commercial and industrial powerhouse of the world, right? And that's going to give them military supremacy. All right. So let's see here. Where are we at here? Oh yeah, Ickes. Okay. So here's a quote from him. He said, "Quote: It would be truly ironical if the United States, having set the pace of industrialization by the use of oil, industrialization rode the back of oil, should be outdistanced by Germany, right?" And I believe that was a key strategic threat. I believe that's why they put Europe first before Japan. The key strategic threat was Germany, Nazi Germany, getting control of the lion's share of the world's oil, which is going to make them the industrial and commercial powerhouse of the world, and then that's going to give them military supremacy, right? And that's going to be real big problems, right? That's why we had to fight the war, and that's why, in my mind, you know, FDR's actions with Pearl Harbor were justified. Uh, that could have been a huge nightmare um, scenario. All right. Then in 1950, the U.S. negotiates a 50-50 deal with Saudi Arabia. Remember they did that with Venezuela here in 43? Well, 1950, they do it with Saudi Arabia and Aramco. So Saudi oil was developed by an American company. It was a consortium of Standard Oil of New Jersey, Saucony, Standard Oil of California, and Texaco. They formed this company, Aramco. And so there's a 50-50 split. Half goes to Saudi Arabia, half goes to Aramco, right? Now, why that was significant is because that led to something I called relative deprivation. You see someone else getting a better deal, you're like, "What? Hey, why can't we get that deal?" So in 1951, Mossadegh was prime minister of Iran, and he pushes for a bill through their parliament. It's passed to nationalize Anglo-Iranian oil. Anglo-Iranian oil, that's British Iranian oil. That's now BP. So all the facilities developed by Anglo-Iranian oil through concessions that were obtained by the Iranian royal family, right? Well, they take control of their own oil, right? So they gain and maintain control over the oil and oil facilities. And I say here relative deprivation, right? They're looking at 50-50 splits. Um, let's see. Okay. All right. So there are 50-50 splits offered. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Venezuela all had 50-50 splits. All right. So Iran's negotiated concession. They're getting about 16.5% profit, and they weren't even allowed to examine the books, so they don't really know what they're getting, right? But and they're pissed about this. They say, "Wait, why do these guys get 50-50? We get 16%, right?" So it was a whole national thing, right? The whole nation's up in arms, right? They're pissed off about this, right? And they just take their own possession of their own oil. Well, this is a threat to the powers that be, we'll say. And what happens is this: the real threat, I believe, is not just Iran nationalizing oil. If you let Iran nationalize its oil in the Middle East, that's a threat that all other Arab nations, Middle East nations, and other nations around the world who are controlled either as a colony or through neo-colonial control of the resources. Some Western nation is controlling the resources. Well, that threatens overthrow and nationalizing those resources around the world. Whatever it is, could be diamonds, could be gold, could be metals, especially like strategic metals. So, yeah. So that's the idea. You can't. That was a big threat. They say communist threat. Well, the big threat was they're going to nationalize their resource, take control of it, and you lose control of that. So the U.S. and the CIA got together and they conducted a coup and overthrew Mossadegh's government, right? Overthrew the Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh, and they installed a dictator. This guy here, the Shah of Iran. The Shah is corrupt and brutal. Spent lavishly. Especially, he spent lavishly on U.S. military weapons. He bought a lot of U.S. military weapons, ships and aircraft and tanks. We're selling them F-14s at the same time our Navy was first getting F-14s. And he uses his secret police, the Savak, to terrorize Iranian people, keep them under, suppress them, torture, assassination, kidnaps. Um, Absolute evidence of U.S. connected to coup, right? I mean, all these documents have been released, and I read a couple of documents. I read the U.S. The CIA official history. I teach this in more detail in my lesson 7 on manufacturing mass movements. That's a section of lesson 7. It's a section on government. Yeah, a lesson on government, and then one section is manufacturing mass movements. And the chief planner for the CIA of this coup was Dr. Wilbur. And then he was tasked to write the secret internal CIA history, other operation, which is used as a training document, how to do this in other places, right? And he also included, was the British plan, and they dovetailed their identical plans, doing the same stuff. Simple things they're doing were bribing the press to create propaganda against Mossadegh. Um, and they manufactured false documents. For example, part of the Wilbur plan said, "Hey, we'll manufacture these false documents to prove that Mossadegh's in league with the communists." Right? Mossadegh was not a communist. He was free market, right? Capitalist, but he was a nationalist who wanted to take control of their oil. That was a threat. And all right, so that's one thing they did, and then they waged economic warfare. One of the things that Dr. Wilbur wrote in his plan is, well, we'll print counterfeit money. The CIA will print counterfeit money and use that to sabotage their economy, and then blame that upon Mossadegh, say he printed it, right? So, and then the key things for economic warfare were the British blockade, right, cutting off trade, cutting off any oil exports, right, and also when the Iranians nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil facilities, right, the techs left, so they didn't have now to run the plants, right, whether it's pumping plants or whether it's refineries, right, and they destroyed infrastructure. They destroyed key equipment, so these plants couldn't operate, right. This was the reason why Iran was broken down to its knees, right? They lost the revenue, lost the oil industry. And then a key thing to kick off the coup was the CIA and British planned attacks, right? Where they attacked like these key religious leaders and then blame it on Mossadegh. So they were bombing key leaders, and then they had other leaders standing by. They set up other leaders standing by to blame Mossadegh, right? So this was all set up by the CIA and MI6, these attacks, right? And that kicked off the coup, and they overthrew the government, and they restored oil to the British. Typically, we overthrow foreign governments when our economic interests are threatened, okay? Some examples of democracies we've overthrown is, well, we overthrew Iran. Why do we overthrow Iran? Because they nationalized oil. Who do we put in power? The Shah, a dictator, right? Chile, they moved to nationalize their copper. Copper was important back then because that was communication, right? There wasn't satellite, right? You communicated by wire. Whether it was telephone or telegraph, it was by wire, right? No wireless, no communication with satellites, right? Well, actually, the first satellites were going up right about then. First ones, like it's Pinochet. I think that was in the 70s. So, I think Sputnik was in the 60s, right? But still, it's dominated by wire. So he wants to nationalize copper, and he's overthrown. They put in Pinochet, who was a brutal, bloody dictator. Guatemala, our Benz wanted land reform. He wanted economic independence, just like Mossadegh. Free market, right? Very modest reforms, and he's labeled a communist, just like Mossadegh, right? Use that to justify overthrowing him, right? And they install Armas, and Guatemala was an exceptional nightmare. 40 years of brutal dictators, 40 years of a murderous, reign of these dictators. Uh, it's sickening. Um, so recall neo-colonialism, right? You install a dictator. We weren't promoting democracies. We're installing dictators around the world. You better control a dictator. It's easy to control a dictator. Why? It's hard to control the entire population of another nation. They're going to want to push their interest. Well, that's not your interest. Your interest is your country, your corporations, right? And so it's to control foreign nations' economy and their resources, right? It's better to install dictators, right? You can get leverage over them. You can corrupt them, right? You can get concessions out of them. That's a classic method of neocolonialism. You make them dependent upon you. Remember I told you about dependency up here, right? Dependency with the CIA trade here. They try to grow their own food. You whack their food, right? Um, you create dependency. An unstable regime needs military support, needs training for their forces, right? You provide that. You keep them in power. Also, you know how Britain gained control of basically all of Iranian resources. Literally, they gained control over the years of all Iranian resources, even printing their currency, right? They got that through the Iranian royal family who produced nothing, had no means of wealth or income, and they would just sell off, Iranian resources, right? Totally undemocratic, not representing the people, just to support themselves, keep themselves rich. They sold out the whole damn country, right? You think the Iranian people weren't pissed? All right, so that's the idea. You control things through just a dictator, right? So why overthrow democracies? Well, that's why. It's easier to control their resources and economies through a dictator than democracy. You can't control democracy. They vote for their own interest. All right, so everyone thinks, well, U.S. promotes democracies around the world. Not true. We supported dictators all around the world. All right, all right. So let me show you the real threat. I used a cartoon to explain this real threat here. Uh, in this cartoon, you got these cavemen here. You got this caveman here. These cavemen are trying to cook their food, holding their food in the fire with their hands, and they're like, right, right. And then this guy's using a stick, and they're like, hey, look what Zog do. What the hell, right? So I use this example. This is like Iran. Iran nationalized its oil. He's like, oh, I'm so happy I nationalized my oil. And all these guys are like, hey, look what Iran do, right? Why don't we nationalize our oil, right? Now, it's not just oil, it's everything. That's why, if you know the history of colonialism, I'm not going to get into all the history of colonialism, but it started a fracture with World War II, right? During World War II, all the main, colonial powers were busy fighting, each other and, fighting Germany, whatever. And that allowed a lot of independence in these colonies, right? And after the war, countries like Britain and France, traditional colonial powers, tried to reimpose their colonial rule. The first testing ground was Vietnam, right? You can't let them. They want to go independent, right? They gained their independence. That Japan's kicked out, defeated, right? So that was a French colony. Britain helped them because you can't allow any of these to go independent. If you allow anyone to go independent, then they're all going to go independent, right? And then you got a unmanageable nightmare on your hands because all throughout the world, all your counties are revolting. You got revolutions. It's like the Spanish Empire in Americas when Napoleon invaded them. Right, they're weak. Every damn colony throughout the Americas, from Mexico through Central America, through Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Argentina, they all broke free. Paraguay, Ecuador, they all broke free. Now, it's beyond control. So you can't allow that. So that's why they made a big push in Vietnam, right? Indochina War, which later became our war, Vietnam War, right? It's because they're trying to reimpose colonial rule. And same thing here. You can't allow. The threat is loss of economic control. The threat is loss of resource control. You can't allow Iran to nationalize because everyone else is going to do it, right? You got to squash that. So they overthrew the damn government. Does that make sense, right? Uh, all right. And I said here, you know, um, this explains why we supported so many brutal and corrupt dictators. Americans have this fairy tale belief that we're promoting democracies around the world. For so long, going back into the 19th century, we're supporting dictators, right? Well before communism, this whole thing. Oh, it was dictatorships and double standards. Well, we got to support these dictators because they're better than communists, right? Right? Well, we're supporting dictators going way back. That was our policy. Way before communism, we're supporting dictators. We're overthrowing governments going way back before it was a communist threat. And it's to control their resources. All those banana wars we fought, that's before communism was a threat there. It was because they wanted to just take over control of their own resources, right? So we're setting up brutal dictators. Um, and I'm going to tell you right now, I complained about this way back in the 1980s. I was writing on the ship's computer my thoughts, and I was talking to people in the wardroom, other officers, right? And then that's when I came under surveillance. I caught the attention of the wrong people. It was naval intelligence at first, right, when I was in the Navy, which wasn't bad, but then they transferred me over to the CIA, FBI, and these guys played dirty, all right. And that's when all the attention came on me. They started screwing with me, watching me 24/7. They followed me 24/7. They played all sorts of dirty games, right? And then from 2007, they were whacking me with toxic things, toxic mold and viruses, bacteria, all right? Playing these games, and they're using it for ad hominem. They do these things to discredit me, and it all started with just two things. Way back in the 1980s, I said basically two main things, right? I looked at the Soviet threat and said, this is bullshit. We're fed this propaganda of this massive Soviet threat, right? Now, unless you live through that era, right, you're not going to realize. People today, young people today, they're not going to realize how massive fear there was of the Soviet military threat, right? That was fed to the American public. And you know what? Whatever the American public are fed, they're going to believe. People say, no, I'm an independent thinker, I'm smart. But no, they go by what they're fed so much, whether it's history, whatever. There's what they're fed. They don't retain information, right? They don't think independently. So everyone believed, I swear, everyone believed in the massive Soviet military threat. I was like the only person out there saying, what are you talking about? They're about to fall apart, right? All you got to do is look at, what I did is I did a quick sociological analysis of the Soviet Union, right? And looking at the military history, the pattern in warfare, what would happen, looking at the nature of their country, the Soviet Union, how they're just a loose conglomerate of diverse nationalities. They had like 14 languages in their country, right? All these different religions, right? All these different national aspirations, independence aspirations. And there's so many times they've had revolts, revolutions in their country when they fought wars. So many times they had massive desertions in their armies, their failed military efforts, so many breakaways. When they went to war, that's an opportunity to try to break away this territory. How many times did Chechen try to break away? Every time there's a war, let's break away, right? And I'm saying, man, right? So military, I'm looking at their equipment too, right? You know, it was a manufactured fear, and I'm saying, hell, man, they're gonna fall apart. What are you talking about? This big military threat? They launch an offensive military camp, they're gonna fall apart. There's gonna be internal revolts, revolutions. They're gonna be pissed off about this, right? That's what's happened in the past, right? The only time they fought well was when Hitler invaded them, threatened genocide on them. Well, of course they're gonna get together and fight pretty well. That's it. World War II, right? And I'm thinking they're getting beat by Afghanistan. What are you talking about, right? They're about ready to fight, and sure enough, they fragmented. They broke apart about 3-4 years after I started saying this, right? And I'm like the only person who didn't have their head up their ass. I swear. All of the Americans like, oh, major Soviet threat, right? I'm thinking, what, right? And that was a threat that was manufactured. The Cold War was a big money maker. And so I'm saying, this is bullshit, right? Who was right? I was the only one who was right. The CIA were totally wrong. Why were they wrong? Because they're all following company speak, the company line. They're towing the company line, probably for their damn careers, right? Probably because everyone's saying it. So that's real because everyone's saying it. That's social reality. It's idiot reality, right? All the idiots get together. All right, so that's one of the things that they're like, oh man, this guy's a threat here. And then I was saying, we're fighting communism, right? That's our main threat back then. Cold War, communism, right? Why are we supporting these damn dictators when the communists are saying that's exactly what we're doing? And the main communist threat was not in the industrialized nations. The main communist threat was in these third world countries. That's where you had all the revolutions, and those revolutions were largely trying to take control of their own destinies, their colonies. Those countries were under colonial control, and it was about colonial independence, right? That was the heart of the anti-communist threat. And then we were installing dictators around the world. We're just feeding in their line. We're feeding their what they're saying, right? We're validating what the communists are saying. Now, why are we doing that? We're trying to fight communism. We're helping communism. We're building communism, right? We're proving them right. So it just didn't make, and so basically this is old. This predates communism. This is old colonial method, and then later neo-colonial methods. It's been done for centuries. This far preceded communism. Same thing's done. You go into a country to control that country. You set up a dictator. You set up a royal family, right? Right. You help keep them in power, and you gain concession. You squeeze concessions out of them, control of the resources, right? And by this, right, like a U.S. corporation or whatever, France or Britain or any other nation that are doing colonialism, they gain control of the third world nation's economy. They control their key resources, oil, agriculture, minerals, diamonds, gold, whatever. They control it, right? They control more than that. They control labor. You control their transportation, infrastructure. You develop trains, right? And then you profit off those trains, and carrying freight or passengers, whatever, right? And then you develop their communication. You develop their telegraphs and later telephones. You develop their electricity, right? And then you develop their urban infrastructure, water purification, water, pressurized water, sewage, right? Right? And you control their currencies, right? You control their banking. You control everything in their damn country. What does that allow you to do? That allows you to extract profits through every aspect of their country. Every main aspect of their country, you're extracting profits. Those profits are not being reinvested in their country, fueling development. No, they're being extracted, making the foreign nation wealthy, right? And this blocks their development. It locks them in a cycle of poverty. It makes them dirt poor. They're far worse off than before, when they had a basic, simple, they were able to live as simple farmers or fishers or whatever, right? Now they're far worse off, Infant mortality is going way up and things like that. Lifespans going way down, right? They have poverty and hardship, making them, and they're also very vulnerable to the foreign economy. If the market for like sugar falls, well, then the whole Cuban economy goes down because that's how their economy is geared to it now, right? And that caused revolutions, right? That led to the Spanish-American War. Fed into that. U.S. shifts in policy on sugar. Um, right, so it creates a lot of frustration, resentment, especially towards a dictator who is seen as a puppet, who especially after the U.S. sets him up after a coup, right? You overthrow the damn Iranian democracy, set up a dictator. Well, they're not going to like this guy, right? They're going to see him as a puppet in the U.S. And then he's overthrown in '79. Um, they take our embassy, and we're all pissed off. All right, so we, no matter what they were, we paint them as communists, right? Because then you can overthrow them. Oh, make it part of the Cold War. Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm totally against communism, right? I'm totally, free market, right? Although I'm for a regulated, controlled market, so you have you don't have people screw it up, destroy the market. You want an efficient, effective market. Um, but the market is the best means of controlling and distributing resources and stimulating productivity, stimulating human motivation and effort and energies, right? Uh, yeah, so in a lot of cases, we fueled communist movements or we exaggerated them, and in some cases, we outright manufactured them, right? It's like Mossadegh. We'll manufacture these fake documents to prove that Mossadegh's in league with the communists, right? I mean, just the way Dr. Wilbur wrote that, it's funny. We'll manufacture false documents to prove to the people that he's a communist, right? All right, so we set up dictators. We're fueling the Cold War. All right, now a lot of people would say conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory. No, it's just this is what happened, right? We're doing things that are irrational, but they're rational in an economic sense, right? And even fuel the Cold War, that's a moneymaker itself, right? All right. So yeah, I know people are going to attack. Bullshit, bullshit. Yeah, you don't know squat. All right. So then Brazil nationalized its oil in '53 also, right? And then in 1956, a geologist, kind of famous, Hubert, predicted peak oil, that the United States oil reserves are going to reach peak production in 1970. Then it's all downhill from there. And then we're screwed. We're going to rely more and more upon imported oil. That's going to be a currency drain, right? And it can cause increased prices, and it did, right? Cause inflationary pressure, right? Proved true, right? But then fracking kicked in here, right? Remember I said he reached peak oil. So this is his curve, the red, his prediction. The actual numbers was it peaked a little bit higher, but fell just like his curve. So his predictions proved true. Then you get the little bump there. That's the Alaskan oil kicking in, helping us a little bit, right? But we're still dropping off. And then fracking starts kicking in. Becomes big around 2010. All right. Big turning point was 1960. Um, my throat's getting really sore here. I'm going very hoarse. I may quit pretty soon. Pick it up tomorrow morning. All right, so five nations joined together to form OPEC. All right, and OPEC is an oil cartel, right? It's a trust. You join together and you control production. What you do is you agree, how much each of the members nations would produce, right? And you get them all together, sit at a table, you agree, and they cut production to raise price, and they increase the profits this way, right? It's concentrated power over supply, which is monopoly power, right? And OPEC is a very large chunk of the world oil supply, represents about 40% of world oil production that hits the market. Um, that's a huge chunk in just one source. OPEC is a cartel. It was actually patterned after the U.S. cartels during the Great Depression. Prices for oil just fell through the floor, and oil is being wasted, oil is being dumped, right? And to avoid this situation, just like remember how they tried to control milk prices, for example. I don't know if you remember that during the Great Depression. Well, they tried to control oil prices, and FDR allowed for the formation of three cartels in the United States, in Texas, the Texas Railroad Commission, then one in Oklahoma, one in California, right? Now, what the OPEC did is they just patterned after the U.S. cartels. Say, hey, look what the U.S. is doing. We'll just follow them. So they formed the cartel, which is a trust, just like the trust, in U.S. history, whatever, trust for making breakers and electricity, or trust in trains, the um, anyways, if this cartel existed within the United States, it'd be busted up by the Justice Department as a trust, right? What do trusts do? They decrease production to decrease supply, and so raise price, and they jack up the profits that way. But they also the reason why they're busted up in the United States is um, because if they raise price, that's inflationary. Also, it causes an increase in input costs for businesses. All other businesses are hurt, right? So it hurts our economy as a whole. It destroys their competitiveness. If they're dealing with overseas exports, all right. So that's why trusts are broken up, because it's an overall drag on our economy, increasing input costs across the board for different companies, right? Making it harder for them to do business, making them less efficient, right? Making them less competitive. So they bust them up, right? But now OPEC is not within the United States. It's out of the jurisdiction of the Justice Department. So how do you bust them up, right? That's a key thing. I'm going to stop here because my voice is getting sore. So how do you bust OPEC? That's what Woolsey said. The first priority of government should be destroying OPEC. Destroying them should be the first priority of those in government, right? If they want a market economy. Well, and he's talking about for economic viability, national security, stability of nations. That's his bottom line. Gotta bust OPEC. How do you bust OPEC? Right? Keep that in mind. How do you destroy OPEC? Right? We're going to talk about that throughout the rest of this whole lecture. What is done to destroy OPEC? What is done to regain control of oil price? Because peak oil is coming. Once peak oil comes, we lose control of oil price, right? And oil price is the key factor in our economy. All right, so we'll stop there.